So there's a few classes I wanted to go over for handling date. When Java first came out, it had some classes that it used to handle date. But then Java made an update in Java 8 to provide new classes to handle date and time, and it made it a lot easier to get a date and time. So the original way to get date and time is to use the calendar class. Now, even though there's a new way to get date and time, you would definitely run into some cases where the original classes are still in use. So the class we need is a calendar class, and it's in the java.util package. So I imported my calendar class. Now I need to get an instance of the calendar class. So the way I get an instance of the calendar class is similar to the way that I would get an instance of the number formatter class, is I invoke a static method, get_instance, through the class name, calendar. And once I have the calendar instance, I can go ahead and print that out to the console. So I'm going to compile and run this program. And here's my output. Now keep in mind, all this information is actually coming from my computer because that's where this program is running. So anything on my computer is being shown here, like the type of calendar is a Gregorian calendar. It goes off the time zone, American Chicago. So there's a lot of information here, but this doesn't really do anything for me. So what I need to do is actually grab a date from this calendar. So in order to store a date off the calendar, I need to use the date class. That date class also lives in the java.util package. Now that I've imported my date class, I can create an object reference variable for date and get a date object off my calendar. So the way I get a date object from the calendar is called a method getTime. If you want to learn more about the calendar class, you can look up the Java API, and it provides all the methods that you need to know in order to use the calendar class. So once I grab an instance from the calendar, I store it into my object reference variable, and I go ahead and print that out to my console. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. And here's my result. It's using the time on my local machine. Now the next thing I want to do is show you how to format this output. And we're going to do that using the simple date format. And that lives in the java.text package. So you can see I inputted my simple date format class. Then the next thing I do is create an object reference variable, and I instantiate an instance of the simple date format. Now the simple date format works just like all my other formatters, where I use my object and invoke the method format, and then I pass in the thing that I want to format. In this case, I'm passing in a date, and let's go ahead and compile and run this program. And here's my output. As you can see, it has a default formatter set. If I wanted to change that, I can. You can go to the Java API and look up all the different things that we can do to format our date and our time to the values that you want. But I'm already familiar with some of these, so I'm just going to go ahead and type this in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in a string that's going to specify the format that I want to use so that I'm not using the default format that I used before when I printed this out. And here's the format I chose. So if we look this up, we can learn a lot of different things that we can specify in here to format the date to what we want. But when we use M in all caps, that's a month. But I'm using 3. So I'm telling Java I want the month to be 3 characters. I'm putting a D for the day, and then I'm putting 3 Ys for the year. Now, if I would have put 2 Ds for the year, Java would have prefixed a 0 in front of the day if it was a single digit. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run, and there's my result. Now, if I wanted to include time, I can add the hour, minute, second, and the time zone. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I went ahead and added to my format. I use H for hour, lowercase m for minute, lowercase s for seconds. A is the AM or the PM. Z is the time zone. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. And here is my result. So I Googled the Java API for the date time formatter. And in here, it's going to show you all the different symbols that we can use in order to specify the format that we want. So for instance, if we were to use a capital D, it's going to be the day of the year. So maybe you want the day of the year, not actually the day of the month, which is the lowercase d. It's showing you that you can use Y for the year. Now, if you were to use 2 Ys, it would just give you the last 2 digits of the year. You can do things to specify the week. The lowercase a is for AM or PM of the day. For time zone, you can use a lowercase z, which I did, and I got the abbreviated version. If you use the uppercase z, you'll get the time zone offset. So there's a lot of information in the Java API that you can use to properly format the date into the way that you prefer to see your date and your time. Before I move on, I want to show you how the date class actually works. If you actually go to the API for the date class, there's a lot of methods that have actually been deprecated. In fact, I think the only thing that isn't deprecated is the getTime in milliseconds method and the constructor for the date class. The date class actually works off milliseconds. So it's actually the number of milliseconds from the epoch date. The epoch date is a date and time in 1970. So if I were to instantiate an instance of the date object and pass it to 0 for my milliseconds, then I will get the epoch date. I'm going to go ahead and show that. So I created an object reference variable to hold a new date object where I pass in 0 as my milliseconds. I also created a new simple date format just to print out the month, day, and the year. And I went ahead and used that to print out the date now and the epoch date. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run. And there are my results. So if you want to get a date for a specific date, you have to pass in the milliseconds. A lot of the methods in the date class were deprecated. So passing in milliseconds for a specific date seems unreasonable. So what you can actually do is you can actually adjust your calendar for the date that you want. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, so I went ahead and used my calendar instance and I changed the month and the day of the month. So these constants, you can find these in the Java API, but you need to use these constants in order to tell a calendar what exactly you want to change. So I'm telling the calendar I want to change the month, and then I'm passing in 11. Now 11 is actually 12 because months of the calendar are 0 based. So January starts at 0. However, the day of the month isn't 0 based. So if I want the 25th, I pass in 25. I know that's a little confusing. So instead of passing in a 12 for the month, I'm passing in an 11 to specify that I want December. And if I want the 25th, I pass in 25. So for the month, it's 0 based, and for the day of the month, it's 1 based. And then once I do that, I could just get my time off my calendar, which I do right here. And I created an object reference variable, and I named this variable Christmas, and I'm outputting my Christmas date. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program, and here's my results. Now the calendar class may seem a little complicated to use, and I agree, it is a little complicated to use, especially when you have to get into changing time zones. But this is the original way of doing dates in Java. Now they did create some new classes that you can use so that you don't have to use these classes, but these classes have been used so much that you're going to come across them all the time. And there might come a time where you actually have to fix code using the calendar or the date object. But this is how you use the calendar, date, and time in Java. So in Java 8, Java introduced some new classes to handle date and time. Now there's actually a handful of them. I don't have them all memorized. If I want to use date and time using the newer way, I can use a class called local date or a class called local date and time. And I could use the datetime formatter to format those results. I'm going to go ahead and type up a quick example. Here's the example I typed up. I'm using local date. The local date class is in the time package. And then I'm using the datetime formatter that's also in the time package, but inside of format in the time package. I created my formatter object. Now to create the formatter object, I'm using the static method of pattern. So this exists off the datetime formatter class. And to get my time now, I use local date, and then I invoke the static method now. And to get the time for Christmas, I use local date, and I invoke the static method of, and I pass in the year, the month, and the day. So if I want December, I pass in a 12. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. And here are my results. Now I'll just say I wanted to output time. Now I can't use the local date to output time. So if I were to go over here and try to display hour and compile and run, I would get an error. So when I compile and run, I get an error. Local date only handles the date and not time. So if I wanted to use the time as well as the local date, then there's a class called local date time. If I only wanted the time, then there's a class called local time. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate those classes to you. I went ahead and imported the local date time and the local time. I created two formatters to handle the date and time and one to handle just time. I created two object reference variables, one for local date time and one for just time. And I'm using the now static method in order to get those times. So on local date time, I use now to get the date and time. And on local time, I use now just to get the time. And I created the variables now with time and now just time. And then I added two other object reference variables for local date and time. One I set is an appointment, and I made an appointment of 2021, August 14th at 6:30. Then I made an object reference variable named alarm that holds a local time, and I gave it a time of 8 o'clock in the morning. Now note that 6 o'clock is 18 because it's the 18th hour in the day. So let's go ahead and compile and run this program. And here are my results. So here's where I'm using the local date time, and here's where I'm using just time. Now notice that this doesn't have time zone, so there's also a class to include time zone. Another thing you can do with this is you can actually add days or months or years to a particular date. So for instance, if I wanted to get Christmas time plus 3 days, I can take my local date for Christmas and add those days to it. I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate that really quick. So if you look at the Java API, there's all kinds of methods that you can use. So one of the methods is plus days. So I can add a number of days to local date. So I took Christmas and I invoked the method plus days. I added 3 and then I passed that to the formatter. So now when I compile and run, I get this as my output 3 days after Christmas. So the new classes introduced in Java 8 actually make it really easy to handle dates if you're just wanting to display date and time. There's a few more classes that I didn't cover, but I don't actually plan on testing you guys on any of this information, but this is all good information to know. So when you actually move on to the next Java class or even into more advanced programming classes, handling date is always something that you should be experienced with.